Good. The mic is working. Audio test is largely functional. All right. We are going to redo the recording of A Gentle Introduction to Unqualified Reservations, Chapter 1, The Red Pill by Mencius Moldbug, published January 8, 2009. And I'm not going to do it all in one take, but I opened a Guinness and a can Triple Shot Energy coffee because it's late when I'm recording this. So I'm going to go ahead and open those. So if I slur or speed up during this recording, you'll know why. I thought it'd be fun to kick off the year by retro-introducing Unqualified Reservations for the benefit of innocent new readers and crazy old ones alike. Continuing, you are readers. Obviously, you are not crazy. It's everyone else who's crazy. Thanks for coming back in 2009. If you need a link to introduce your other crazy friends to UR, this is probably a good one. New UR readers, unfortunately, I'm lying. There is no such thing as a gentle introduction to UR. It's like talking about a mild DMT trip. If it was mild, okay, then it wasn't DMT. UR is a strange blog. My goal is to cure your brain. We've all seen The Matrix. We know about red pills. Many claim to sell them. You can go, for example, to any bookstore, ask the guy behind the counter for some Noam Chomsky, and what you'll get is blue pills soaked in red number 3. Since we provide the genuine article, UR is pretty much the anti-Chomsky. As a broad generalization, UR's stance in any controversy will probably be the opposite of Chomsky's. Take one of your red pills, or heck, split it in half, and you'll be in a completely different world. Like DMT, except that DMT reality is prettier than your reality. UR's is uglier. Also, DMT wears off. Alas, our genuine red pill is not ready for the mass market. It's about the size of a golf ball, somewhere but nowhere near as smooth, and, halfway down, it splits in half and exposes a sodium metal core, which will sear your throat like a live coal. There will be scarring, but what can we say? That's what you get for being an early adopter. But at least you didn't buy a Newton. Linked here, the Apple Newton, the 1998 release, one of the first things that Apple ever released. When we think about red and blue pills in the real world, obviously we are going and thinking about the Orwellian mind control state. We are not going to cure your whole brain. After the treatment, for instance, you might still be a Celtics fan. Our chemical interest is solely in the political lobe. Unfortunately, this organ is unusually large and proliferating fast. After the treatment, it will return to its normal, marble-like size, and you may hear a hollow sound if you knock your fist hard against the back of your head. That's because now you know the truth, and you never need to think about any of that crap ever again. Since the shape of your skull is unchanged, the resulting void is percussive. When we think about the Orwellian mind control state, we usually think about a few really big, obvious examples. The Nazis, the Soviets, so on. These regimes, of course, specialized in implanting bizarre, sometimes murderous, instructions in their subjects' brains. If you must visualize these implanted Orwellian modules, you can think of them as little worms, like in Wrath of Khan, that crawl up into your ear and stay there. One imagines writing a letter to a dedicated National Socialist, explaining why he should expel his evil neural parasite and instead become a good liberal, signing it Das Future, and emailing it through some time machine back to 1938. Maybe that could be the original red pill, who knows? Here at UR, we have many sinister devices, but a time machine is not one of them. And unfortunately, you do not live in Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, or 1938, and even more fortunately, your democratic education has vaccinated you to perfection against the first, and to an adequate but pretty unimpressive level against the second. And most unfortunately of all, your government is nothing like either Nazi Germany's or the Soviet Union's. All good. But in 1938, 3 systems of government were contending for global supremacy. One of them is still around. Yours. Anglo-American liberal democracy. Had military luck favored either of the others, National Socialism or Marxist-Leninism, we can also be sure that it would have discovered and revealed and reveled in all of its foes' every misdeed, and that it would have approached its own, if at all, tentatively and ambiguously. If only one can survive, at least 2 must be illegitimate, and irredeemably criminal, therefore. And the survivor will certainly paint them as such, but suppose all 3 are irredeemably criminal. If the third is an Orwellian mind control state as well, its subjects are unlikely to regard it as such. It will certainly not prosecute itself. The third, our third, is very different from the other two. We must remember that American democracy is categorically distinct from National Socialism and the people's democracies in too many ways to count. Since there are too many ways to count, we will not bother counting them. We remain entitled to notice parallels. For instance, it is almost more aesthetic criticism than political or economic analysis, but do read Wolfgang Scheivelbusch's 3 New Deals. The book linked here in the reading is actually linked directly to Amazon, which I think is pretty entertaining. It's about $20 in hardcover or $10 in paperback. But no number of categorical distinctions from the other two can alter our estimate of the third's criminality. There are as many ways to be a criminal as there are crimes. That we hang the murderer does not mean we must award a prize to the thief. I.e., the assumption that, since the Third Reich was Orwellian, and Barack Obama is probably not Adolf Hitler, Washington must not be Orwellian, is completely fallacious. Socrates is a cat. Ribbentrop is not. Ribbentrop is not Socrates. Therefore, Ribbentrop is not a cat. Comparing the totalitarian dictatorships of the mid-20th century to the OECD democracies of the early 21st is like comparing a reptile to a mammal, a propeller plane to a jet plane, or a flashlight to a taser. We may learn something about the latter from the former, but we may not, and we are easily misled. But they are what we think of when we think of Orwell, and the association must be tackled first. Anyway, let's define this vague charge. What do we mean by Orwellian? I'd say a fair definition of an Orwellian government is one whose principle of public legitimacy, cited here, Mosca's political formula, if you care, is a link to Gaetano Mosca. Italian pronunciation as follows, was an Italian political scientist, journalist, and public servant. He is credited with developing the elite theory and the doctrine of the political class, and is one of 3 members constituting the Italian school of elitism, together with Wilfrid Pareto and Robert Michels. But I'd say a fair definition of an Orwellian government is one whose principle of public legitimacy, again the citation, is contradicted by an accurate perception of reality. In other words, the government is existentially dependent on systematic public deception. If it fails in its mission to keep the lie alive, it at least stands some chance of falling. The basic premise of UR is that all the competing 20th century systems of government, including the Western democracies, which came out on top and which rule us to this day, are best classified as Orwellian. They maintain their legitimacy by shaping public opinion. They shape public opinion by sculpting the information presented to the public, of course. As part of that public, you peruse the world through a lens poured by your government, i.e. you are pwned. Cited here, pwned links to Urban Dictionary, a corruption of the word own, and this originates in the online game called Warcraft, World of Warcraft, where a designer misspelled owned. When the computer beat a player, it was supposed to say owned, but instead, it just kept saying pwned. Thus, the red pill. Any stimulus or stimulant, pharmaceutical or literary, that fundamentally compromises said system of deception. That sounds very medical, but let's be clear. You are not taking our pill as a public service. At least, with our present crude packaging, the remedy is not accessible to any politically significant percentage of citizens. Rather, you are dosing up because you'd rather be high. Despite the agony of indigestion and ingestion, it's just too much fun to see your old reality from the outside. This, rather than, quote, society, unquote, is why you will return to UR again and again. Seen from the outside, the Western democracies are particularly elegant examples of Orwellian engineering. They seem to function in the context of a free press and fair contested elections. They operate no gulags. Not only has UR never been bothered by the authorities, I have not yet received a single private communication that I would describe as in any sense unfriendly. So how on earth can the system be described as Orwellian? Well, easily, of course. Everyone describes it as Orwellian, Professor Chomsky for one, but UR gets the same result in a very different way. You now enter a journey from which your soul may not return. Don't say we didn't warn you. The back button is up and to the left. Like yourself the way you are, you might not want to just press that. Alright. It's actually quite simple to demonstrate how you've been, quote, pwned, unquote. Let's start the show with one of UR's earliest Sith mind tricks. Jedi mind tricks are blue pills, Sith mind tricks are probably red pills. Suffice it to say that you've been exposed to a lot of anti-Sith propaganda. We'll start with a point of agreement. As a good citizen of America, which is the greatest country on earth, one thing you believe in is separation of church and state. I too am an American, and it so happens that I believe in separation of church and state, although one might argue that my interpretation of that formula is a tad different than yours. So let's understand what we mean by the formula, word by word. What do we mean when we say state? We mean the government. I bet that's sufficiently clear. What do you mean by separation? If A and B are separated, A has nothing to do with B, e.g. whether church and state are, if separated, they have as much to do with each other as the Albanian Gulf Federation as the Alaskan Alliance for Beef, i.e. nothing, I hope. I think that's pretty clear. If the Alaska cattleman can rent that courts outside Durazzo, so can anyone else. Presumably the opposite. Bad if separation good would be union of church and state. What do we mean by church? That's more of a Bueller question, isn't it? Not a lot of people want to jump up at that one. Clearly, if we have some general objection to union of church and state, these objections must in some way be derived from some generic definition of the word church. But when we use words like church, religion, etc., while it is very easy to think of examples, the Catholic Church, Islam, etc., it is considerably more difficult to construct a description which includes all the examples and excludes all of the non-examples. Of course, one may have a perfectly reasonable prejudice against the Pope, Muslims, etc. But if so, why don't you just say so? For example, it's very easy to conclude God or gods in one definition of church, but that would actually throw out Buddhism, which is surely a legitimate religion. I assume your version of separation of church and state includes separation of Buddhism and state. Well, mine sure does. What about Scientology? Should we have separation of Scientology and state? I'm guessing you'd sign up for that one as well. Fair enough, I would too. The question seems difficult, so let's procrastinate. For a straw definition of church, though, let's say a church is an organization or movement which specializes in telling people what to think, since that seems to work. I wouldn't inquire into this definition too closely, lest you ruin the suspense. But surely it fits Scientology, the Southern Baptists, Buddhism, etc. That's close enough for now. This definition of state, separation, and church gives us three interpretations of why separation of church and state is such a good idea. 1. Our definition of church might include the stipulation that a church is an organization that distributes misinformation, i.e. lies, or unfalsifiable hypotheses, and other bogus truths. This sounds very sensible because we don't want the state to distribute misinformation for obvious reasons. On the other hand, this is not a very useful definition. It is equivalent to a restriction that union of church and state is okay as long as the state church teaches only the truth. Naturally, according to the church, it teaches the truth. But it is difficult to imagine a clause in the Constitution which states, Congress shall establish a church which shall teach only the truth. From an engineering perspective, the restriction is more effective if it does not depend on some process for distinguishing true churches from false churches. Right? Alright, 2. We might say that whether they teach the truth or not, churches are just kind of a bad idea, period. People should think for themselves. They should not have thoughts broadcast into their little antenna in the back of their head. Therefore, the state should separate itself from the church, just because a good state should separate itself from all evil things. But fortunately, or unfortunately, there is no kingdom of philosophers. Most people do not think for themselves, and should not think for themselves, and cannot be expected to think for themselves. They do exactly what they should be doing, and trust others to work out the large philosophical truths of the world for them. This trust may be well placed, or not, but surely this mechanism of delegation is an essential aspect of human society, with the humans we have now. 3. We might believe that a government should not tell its subjects what to think. Since this is the only option I have left, it's the one I'm going to follow. I'd like to think that you'd follow it as well. If not for the same reason, okay, let's think about it. There are two kinds of government. Those whose formula of legitimacy depends on popular consent, and those whose does not. Following contemporary usage, we can classify these as authoritarian and democratic. An authoritarian state has no need to tell its subjects what to think, because it has no reason to care what they think. In a truly authoritarian government, the ruling authority relies on force, not popularity. It cares what its subjects do, not what they think. It may encourage a healthy, optimistic attitude and temperate lifestyle proclivities, but only because this is good for business. Therefore, any authoritarian state that needs an official religion must have something wrong with it. Perhaps, for example, its military authority and force is not as absolute as it likes to think. A democratic state which tells its citizens what to think is a political solecism. Think about the motivation for democracy. It consigns the state to the collective responsibility of the citizens, because it feels this is an independent and well-anchored hook on which to hang the common good. Once the republic has been established, and has an established church, this hook is no longer independent, and the postulated value add of democracy is essentially nullified. You're not gaining anything. Without separation of church and state, it is easy for a democracy to indulge itself in arbitrary, irresponsible misgovernment, simply by telling its bishops to inform their congregation that black is white and white is black. Thus misdirected, they are easily persuaded to support counterproductive policies, which they wrongly consider to be productive. A common syndrome is the case in which a purported solution is in fact the cause of the problem. As a Russian politician once said of his opponents, these people think they are the doctors of society. In fact, they are the disease. Citation 1. This is a slight misquote of Alexander Herzen, the, quote, father of Russian socialism, unquote, who reportedly once declared not to his opponents, but to his fellow revolutionaries, that we are not the doctors, we are the disease. Herzen meant this as an exhortation to tear down the existing order and overthrow the Tsar, of course. It is indeed surprising that Nassim Taleb has just learned, as of 2009, the word iatrogenic. Iatrogenic here, meaning iatro, healer, medicine, from the Greek iatros, healer, producing. Iatrogenic means relating to illness caused by medical examination or treatment. You go to the doctor, you get a flu shot, you get a disease, you get the flu. That is an iatrogenic disease. By the way, if you know Taleb, please point him at UR. If you know someone who knows Taleb, please. Union of church and state can foster stable iatrogenic misgovernment as follows. First, the church fosters and maintains a popular misconception that the problem exists, and the solution solves it. Secondly, the state responds by extruding an arm, agency, or other pseudopod in order to apply the solution. Agency and church are thus cooperating in the creation of unproductive and counterproductive jobs as, quote, doctors, unquote. Presumably, they can find a way to split the take. The root problem with a state church is a democracy is that to believe in democracy, one must believe that the levers of power terminate with the voters, or should. But if your democracy has an effective state church, the actual levers of power would pass through the voters, go back to the church. The church teaches the voters what to think. The voters tell the politicians what to do. Naturally, it is easy for the politicians to short-circuit all this process and just listen to the bishops. Thus, the government has a closed power loop, with the church at its apex, of course, which is exactly what we were hoping to avoid when we decided to make our state democratic, rather than authoritarian, an independent and unaccountable authority, which is in charge of everything else. In the case, our authority is, of course, the church itself. Oops. We have engineered ourselves a nice big failure. In other words, our so-called democracy is dependent not on the wisdom of the people, but on the internal power politics of the official church. If these politics produce a national political platform, or just a political platform, which translates to responsible and effective actions, the government will be good. If they don't, it will suck. Either way, we have consigned the state to an unaccountable conclave of bishops. Why this is an improvement on monarchy or any other form of autocracy is unclear. This political architecture and abortion by any standard is commonly known as a theocracy. Oddly enough, the classic historical case of theocracy is... hold on. I'm forgetting... yes, right here in North America, actually. The classical reference could be under those strange people we used to call the Puritans. A more precise label would be Brownist. I'm with Shakespeare on this one. Note that, cladistically speaking, we are all Brownists now. And Carter Van Carter has told us all about Whitby. Let Daniel Howe fill you in on Scrooby. Scrooby, again, being the Puritan Republic of the Massachusetts Bay in New England, link here. Scrooby being the Google Books original title. For those who prefer their history fresh rather than aged, we can turn to Darren Staloff, whose Making of an American Thinking Class, Intellectuals and Intelligentsia in Puritan Massachusetts is badly written, but quite informative. Professor Staloff writes, italics are his, I'll do it in a different voice. The Puritan ministers created a completely new form of political authority, in the Weberian sense of legitimate power, which I have called cultural domination. Cultural domination, as here conceived, requires 4 formal supports. First of all, like charismatic authority, it requires recognition in the form of ritual election or some other similar mechanism of oath swearing or covenant signing. Fealty is sworn to the correct cultural formation, in this case, Puritan biblicism. And the office holder is empowered only as the specially trained bearer of an interpreter of the cultural tradition. The laity generally conceive of this high cultural training, whether centered around biblicism or some other intellectually legitimating principle like reason or rationality, as being endowed with an automatic efficacy that need simply be applied to any problem to generate an unequivocal solution. The biblical truth is eternal and immutable, claimed Thomas Hooker, quote, but the alteration grows according to God's most just judgment and to their own deservings. Such belief gives rise to the second formal requirement, that officially authorizes bearers of the cultural tradition must always agree in their public formations or at least not disagree. If this condition is violated, the laity may come to see the cultural tradition as an amorphous collection of expressions or principles manipulated by mandarins for their own aggrandizement. A third requirement is that all public expression of the culturally able must be bestowed on these public acts, including forced attendance, titulary homage, and silent obedience. Finally, to ensure the stability of the entire system, unauthorized cultural expressions must be carefully monitored or severely suppressed when they contradict or threaten to desacralize the authorized formulas. The crafty Professor Staloff, like all good historians, is trying to sneak a message about the present into his narrative of the past. Note that little quibble he had there. Quote, or some other intellectually legitimating principle like reason or rationality, unquote. Why would he say that? Professor Staloff, who has clearly been reading too much H.P. Lovecraft, provides a clue in his introduction. How could an educated elite of ministers and magistrates, as I learned from Timothy Breen, hold such dominant power in a fledgling colonial settlement? Granted the deference normally accorded a university degree, these educated leaders lacked the large-scale property interests normally associated with a ruling stratum. What were the institutional arrangements and practices that facilitated this remarkable empowerment? Finally, why did this elite choose to use their power to impose an order on Massachusetts derived from academic theology? What did it mean that the Bay Colony was patterned after high cultural theory? I sought to answer these 2 questions in the library of Miskatonic University. 2 works in particular. Falconer's 3-volume Cryptomimesis Patefacta and von Juntz's strange Unaspecifiken Kulten confirmed my most unsettling hunches. Professional intellectuals and intelligentsia compromised a collective interest. They were the great unexamined class in all modern political history, whose will to power occasionally took the form of revolutionary ideological politics. I had a greater appreciation, and now, for the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred's claim that the Puritan divines were the precursors of the Jacobins and the Bolsheviks. Professor Staloff, we see, speaks elliptically, but with great urgency. What exactly is his message to the initiated? Or, how can we translate this dark prophecy into plain Saxon tongue? I'm afraid the proposition Professor Staloff is hinting at is that we do, in fact, have a state church. It just doesn't call itself that, because why would you? By this simple twitch of the hips, like a receiver dodging a linebacker, it has faked our intellectual immune system off of its feet. Not to worry, the red pill is here to help. Like Professor Staloff, I have constructed my definition of church as a trap. If you have been following along without suspicion, you are in the trap. I'm going to close the lid now. Notice that our definition of church has not invoked any of the typical attributes of religion. In particular, we have avoided any requirement that A. the doctrines of the Church be either partially or entirely supernatural in nature. Think of Buddhism or Scientology, or for that matter, Nazism or Bolshevism. Or B. the structure of the Church be in any way centrally organized. A Quaker theocracy is just as excluded as a Catholic theocracy. And once your church is united with the state, there is no shortage of structure. We have just said, a church is an organization or a movement which tells people how to think, a broad definition. But it turns out to be perfectly adequate to validate our case for separation of church and state. And it contains all our test cases. There's just one problem. The definition is just slightly too broad. It captures some cases which we obviously wouldn't want to include. See, under this definition, Harvard's a church. And we surely can't mean that there should be separation of Harvard and state. Yet somehow, this is the result that the computer, or the algorithm basically, keeps giving us. Is there a mistake? We have stumbled, of course, into Professor Staloff's definition. Unlike the Harvard of 1639, the Harvard of 2009 bases its authority not on the interpretation of Scripture, but on some other intellectually legitimating principle like reason or rationality, to quote Professor Staloff. Everything else is the same. It could be, of course, that Harvard of 2009's application of reason or rationality is inherently accurate, endowed with an automatic efficacy that need simply be applied to any problem to generate an unequivocal solution, to quote Professor Staloff again. Whether or not this is the case, many seem to behave as though it were. But even if it is, all we are looking at is a condition we rejected earlier as unsatisfactory. A state church that teaches only the truth. Perhaps Harvard of 2009 teaches only the truth, and Harvard of 2010, what about that? What about 2020? We resign the answer to the tempests of academic power politics. If this is transparent and accountable, alright, so is mud. The basic security hole is this word education. Education is defined as the inculcation of correct facts and good morals. Thus, an institution which is educational and secular, such as Harvard, simply becomes a, quote, church which shall teach only the truth, unquote. Like the Puritans of New England, in seeking to disestablish one church, we have essentially sanctioned another. It's also hard to argue that we can enjoy separation of Harvard and state. Harvard is conventionally described as a, quote, private university, unquote. This term is strictly nominal. Vast streams of cash flow from the taxpayer's pocket into Harvard's, as they do not flow to, say, the Vatican. And we can see easily that Harvard is attached to something, because the perspective of Harvard in 2009, while wildly different from the perspective of Harvard in 1959, is not in any way different from the perspective of Stanford in 2009. If a shared attachment to Uncle Sam isn't what keeps Harvard and Stanford on the same page, what is? Pro tip, it's not football. Except for a few unimportant institutions of non-mainstream religious affiliation, we simply do not see multiple divergent competing schools of thought within the American university system at this time. The whole vast archipelago, though evenly speckled with assaulting of contrarians, displays no factional structure whatsoever. It seems almost perfectly synchronized. There are two explanations for this synchronization. One, Harvard and Stanford are synchronized because they both arrive at the same truth. I am willing to concede this for, say, chemistry, maybe math, algebra. But when it comes to, say, African American studies, I'm not so sure. Are you? Surely it's arguable that the latter is a legitimate area of inquiry, of course, but surely it is arguable that it is not as well. So how is it, exactly, that Harvard, Stanford, and every other college got the exact same answer? I'm afraid, then, that the only logical alternative, however awful and unimaginable, is the conclusion that Harvard and Stanford are somehow synchronized because both are remorse attached in some unthinkable way to some great invisible predator of the deep, perhaps even Cthulhu himself. Maybe not. Certainly, the synchronization is not coordinated by any human hierarchical authority. Yes, there are accreditation agencies, but a Harvard or a Stanford could very easily fight them. The system may be Orwellian, but it has no goals. It produces this word Gleichschaltung without a Gestapo. Gleichschaltung, referenced here, would be a reference to the Nazi Party successfully establishing a system of totalitarian control and coordination over all aspects of German society and societies accepted by Nazi Germany. Quote, from the economy and free trade to the media, culture, and education. All of it. Again, the system may be Orwellian, but it has no globals. It produces Gleichschaltung without a Gestapo. It has a party line without a party. It's a pretty fucking neat trick. We at the Sith would certainly like to understand it. We are, again, reminded of the half-mad words of the late Professor Staloff. Officially authorized bearers of the cultural tradition must always agree in their public formulations, or at least not disagree. Cthulhu relea wasnagen vertagen. If this condition is violated, the laity may come to see the cultural tradition as an amorphous collection of expressions or principles manipulated by mandarins for their own aggrandizement. But if Harvard in 2009 fits this description, how exactly is said agreement enforced? If you've ever met any of the officially authorized bearers, you know the last thing they think of themselves as being is officially authorized bearers. It's also one thing to say that we must always agree, another to make them actually do that. No one does, and yet they seem to agree anyway. Their views change over time, and they all seem to trend in the same direction at the same time. There is a strange self-organizing quality about this design. Does the American university system maintenance of broad unanimity, despite the clear absence of anything like a coordinating executive authority, make it seem less creepy to you, or more? I'm going to go with more. That's me, though. Moreover, if we broaden our focus on the university system to the entire system of education, from grade school to journalism, we see this effect again and again. What exactly is the mainstream media? If we accept the ecclesiastical metaphor, the newspaper is actually a perfect analog to the church proper. It's simply the latest transmission technology for your worm's daily and weekly security update. And here again, a coordinated message without any central agency. Dude, do you find this creepy? I gotta ask why not, if you don't. But maybe it's all an abstraction to you, so let's make it slightly more concrete. Alright, let's give me an example, right? In 1963, a long time ago, but in the lives of many people who are now living, the citizens of California, by a majority of 2/3, voted to pass a law called Prop 14. This is cited here, by the way. This amended the state constitution to add the following. Quote, neither the state nor any subdivision or agency thereof shall deny, limit, or abridge, directly or indirectly, the right of any person who is willing or desires to sell, lease, or rent any part of or all of his real property, to decline or sell, lease, or rent such property to such persons or person as he, in his absolute discretion, chooses. Unquote. In other words, if you don't want to live with people of color, you don't have to. The amendment obviously turned out to be unconstitutional, cited here, just like this one. Another citation. This one links us to 1994 California Proposition 187. This one, also known as the SOS Save Our State Initiative, was a 1994 ballot initiative to establish a state-run citizenship screening system and prohibit undocumented immigrants from using non-emergency healthcare, public education, and other services of the state of California. Voters passed the proposed law at a referendum on November 8, 1994. The law was challenged by a legal suit the day after its passage and found unconstitutional by a federal district court on November 11th. In 1999, Governor Gray Davis halted state appeals of this ruling, not allowing anyone to appeal it at all. Anyway, back to where we were. This amendment obviously turned out to be unconstitutional, just like this one, that was the citation, and we have persons of color to this day in California. In fact, we have so many of them that California in 2008 elected Barack Obama, noted person of color, by almost the same margin that its 1963 predecessor passed Proposition 14. Part of this political change was due to said demographic shift, of course, but not all. So, how exactly did California change from a state that would vote for Proposition 14 to one that would elect Obama? Was this change predictable? Was it inevitable? Again, we're seeing the movement of a bobber on the water, but what's that bobber attached to? Is it a bluegill? Or is it Cthulhu? If you're still clinging to the Matrix, you might say the change happened because Prop 14 was wrong and the election of Obama was right. Okay, suppose we agree with you, But why exactly should we have been so confident in expecting a change from wrong to right? If there is some mechanism large and powerful enough to drag the public opinion of California in 45 years from Prop 14 to Obama, maybe not Cthulhu, but definitely not a bluegill, shouldn't we expect it to be just as easily dragged back from right to wrong? Will segregation make a comeback in San Francisco? If not, then why not? Whatever our Cthulhu may be, it is interesting to note that there was an algorithm for predicting the movement of the bobber. On a number of subjects, actually, not just segregation, I note that the public opinion of California in 2008 is quite similar to the public opinion of Stanford in 1963. This is easy to explain. In post-1945 America, the source of all new ideas is the university. Ideas check out of the university. They don't necessarily always check in, but thence, they flow outward to the other arms of the educational system as a whole. The mainstream media and the public schools, eventually, they become our old friend, public opinion. This process is slow, happening on a generational scale, thus, a gradual 45-year lag. Thus, whatever coordinates the university system coordinates the state, through the transmission device of, quote, public opinion, unquote. Naturally, since this is 100% effective, the state does not have to wait for a transmission to complete. It can act in advance of a complete response, as in this case, the Supreme Court did in 1967, and synchronized directly with the universities. This relationship, whose widespread practice in the United States dates back to 1933, is known as public policy. Essentially, for everything your government does, there's a university department full of professors who can and do tell it what to do. Civil servants and congressional staffers follow the technical lead of the universities. The residual Democratic branch of Washington, the White House, can sometimes push back freely, but only with great difficulty. What's neat is that because of our Army's great success in the early 1940s, the government of other countries now responds to American public policy as well. The synchronization is international. Some of Americans' little friends overseas, such as Britain, have universities in the second rank or the first rank, but there is only one global post-war academic system, the American one, and all top-tier universities can be found, generally, in the United States. The con by which policies devised by this system are passed off as global, transcending mere nationality is sometimes called transnationalism or globalism. But I digress. The triangle of professors, bureaucrats, and public opinion is stable because the professors teach as well as advise. Of course, there is a time lag. The system experiences some strain, but it will stay together as long as the polarity does not randomly reverse, i.e., because Cthulhu suddenly decides to swim right rather than left. But no, actually, Cthulhu may swim slowly, but he always swims left. Isn't that interesting? In the history of American democracy, if you take the mainstream political position of the Overton window at time T1 and place it on the map at a later time, that would be time T2. T1 is always to the right, near the fringe, or outside it. So, for instance, if you take the average segregationist voter of 1963 and you let him vote in the 2008 election, he will be way out on the wacky right wing. Cthulhu has passed him by. Where is the John Birch Society now? What about the NAACP? Cthulhu swims left and left and left. There are a few brief periods of true reaction in American history. The post-Reconstruction era, or redemption, the return to normalcy of Harding, and a couple of others. They are unusual and feeble compared to the great leftward shift of American politics. Nor, most important for our hypothesis, did they come from the universities. In the 20th century, periods of reaction are always periods of anti-university activity. McCarthyism is especially noticeable as such. And you'll note, McCarthy didn't exactly win. This principle applies even in wars. In each of the following conflicts in Anglo-American history, you'll see a victory of the left over the right. You can go all the way back to the English Civil War, that so-called Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam. Clearly, if you want to be on the winning side, you want to start on the left side of the field. And we're starting to piece the puzzle together. The leftward direction is itself the principle of organization. In a two-party democratic system with Whigs and Tories, Democrats and Republicans, etc., the intelligentsia is always Whig. Their party is simply the party of those who want to get ahead. It is the party of celebrities, the ultra-rich, the great and the good, the flexible of conscience. The Tories are always misfits, losers, or just plain stupid. Sometimes all three. And the left is the party of the educational organs at whose head is the press and the universities. This is citation 2 at this time, which links us down to the bottom of the page. The entertainment industry arguably belongs on this list as well. Again, and the left is the party of the educational organs, at whose head is the press and the universities. Citation 2. This is our 20th century version of the established church. Here at UR, we sometimes call it the cathedral. Citation here. Citation 3. This terminology is not meant to disparage real cathedrals. The main rhetorical point is that members of the cathedral are, despite their avowed secularism and faux egalitarianism, in effect a theocratic priestly class in all but name. Although it is essential to note that, unlike an ordinary organization, it has no central administrator. No, this will not make it easier to deal with. The opposite, actually. This strange chiral asymmetry implies some fundamental difference between right and left. What is that difference? What does it mean to be left further than right? How can an entire system of independent thinkers and institutions, without any central coordinating agency, recognize that everyone should go left rather than right? First of all, we need to define left and right. In my opinion, obviously a controversial one. The explanation for this mysterious asymmetric dimension is easy. It's political entropy. Right represents peace, order, security. Left represents war, anarchy, crime. Because values are inherently subjective, it is possible to argue that left can be good and right can be bad. For example, if you say that the Civil War was good, the North needed to conquer the South and free the slaves. On the other hand, it is also quite easy to construct a very clean value system in which order is simply good and chaos is simply evil. I have chosen this path. It leaves quite a capacious capacity in the back of my skull, and allows me to carry on and call myself a reactionary. To you, perhaps, it's the dark side. But this is only because the treatment's not yet complete. Whatever you make of the left-right axis, you have to admit that there exists some force which has been pulling the Anglo-American political sphere leftward for at least 3 centuries. Whatever this unfathomable stellar emanation may be, it has gotten us from the Stuarts to Barack Obama. Personally, I would like a refund, but that's just me. It is time to understand this force. My theory is that what we are looking at is the attraction of power itself, citation 4, more specifically power gained by sowing disorder and subverting natural hierarchy, per the identification of left, as the direction of increasing political entropy, as Jim, cited here, Jim being Jim's blog, Liberty in an Unfree World, puts it in, quote, socialism, leftism seems to have no essence. It is just a coalition to knock over the apple cart in order to grab some of the apples. So, lefter is whatever direction looks like some apples can be knocked loose. The left attracts a natural coalition because it always attracts those whose only natural interest is in the pure thrill of domination. Most will join them through peer pressure alone, leaving only the misfits. Let's look for a minute at the minds of the people who hold these positions of power. Your R1 professors, cited here at Research One University, that's the Carnegie classification of institutions of higher learning, which is used to indicate universities in the US that engage in the highest levels of research activity. Your R1 professors, your Times reporters, so on. These are, of course, very competitive jobs, because only a tiny minority of the people who want them and are capable of doing them will ever get them. They have certainly worked very hard to get where they are, and they perceive that effort as one made in the interest of humanity at large, of course. I think the salaries at this level are reasonable, but it is not money that makes people want these jobs, it's usually power, which brings with it status. I define power as personal influence over important events. I don't know of any other good definition. One of the key reasons that intellectuals are fascinated by disorder, in my opinion, is the fact that disorder is an extreme case of complexity. And as you make the structure of authority In an organization more complex, more informal, or both, as you fragment it, eliminating hierarchical execution structures under which one individual decides and is responsible for the result, and replace them with highly fragmented, highly consensual, and highly process-oriented structures in which 10 or 20 or 100 people can truthfully claim to have contributed to the outcome, you increase the amount of power, status, patronage, and employment produced, and all of that can go around. Of course, you also make the organization generally far less efficient and effective, but you make working in it a lot less fun for everyone. You have gone from startup to Dilbert. This is Brezhnevian sclerosis, the fatal disease of organizations in a highly regulated environment. All work is guided by some systemic process, in which each rule was contributed by someone whose importance was a function of how many rules they could add. In the future, we will all work for the government. Individually, this is the last thing your average intellectual wants to do, but it's the direction in which his collective acts are pushing us. In short, intellectuals cluster to the left, generally adopting, as a social norm, the principle of pas d'amis à gauche, pas d'amis à droite. This is kind of a butchered rendition of the French, usually rendered in English as no enemies to the left, no friends to the right. Because, like everyone else, they are drawn to power. The left is chaos and anarchy, and the more anarchy you have, the more power there is to go around. The more orderly a system, the fewer people get to issue orders. The same asymmetry is why corporations in the military, whose system of hierarchical executive authority is inherently orderly, and cluster right. Once the cluster exists, however, it works by any means necessary. The reverence of anarchy is a mindset in which an essentially Machiavellian tribal model of power flourishes. To the bishop of a cathedral, anything that strengthens their influence is a good thing, and vice versa. The analysis is completely reflexive. Far below the conscious level, consider this comparison of the coverage. Citation here. This is linked directly to the American thinker. Quote, dictators to the right of me, presidents to the left of me. Again, consider the comparison of the coverage between the regime of Pinochet and that of Castro. Despite atrocities that are comparable at most, not to mention a much better record in providing responsible and effective government, Pinochet receives the full-out 2 minutes hate. Citation here, linked to the 2 minutes hate, a reference to the 1984 book, basically a dystopian novel. I'm sure everyone's read it at this point. Whereas the treatment of Castro tends to have, at most, a gentle and wistful disapproval. This is because Pinochet's regime was something completely alien to the American mindset, the American intellectual, really. Whereas the relationship between Puritan divines and Bolshevism, being exactly as the mad Arab Abdul al-Hattab says, Castro's regime was something much more understandable. If you sketch the relative weights of the social networks connecting Pinochet to the cathedral versus Castro to the cathedral, you are comparing a thread to a bicep. We also see the nature of the blue pill here. After completing the UR treatment, it is interesting to go back and read your Chomsky. What you'll see is that Chomsky is, in every case, demanding that all political power be in the hands of the cathedral. The American system is large and complex, and this is certainly not the case. The least exception, or God forbid, reversal, and Chomsky's on the case, deploying the old principle of, this animal is very dangerous when attacked. It defends itself. Citation 6 here. The original version of this saying is a French rhyming proverb. C'est un animal est très méchant quand l'attaque s'il te défend. A rhyming English translation has been composed of, by all people, Lolita author Vladimir Nabokov. The beast is very mean. In fact, it will fight back when it is attacked. Again, this animal is very dangerous. When attacked, it defends itself. The progressive has always the underdog in his own mind. Yet the objective reality is that he always seems to win in the end. In other words, the Chomskyan tradition and Chomskyan transformation is to interpret any resistance by a party which is inherently much weaker and as oppression by a magic force of overwhelming strength. For example, we can ask, which set of individuals exerts more influence over American journalists? American professors or CEOs? American diplomats or generals? In both cases, the answer is clearly the former, Yet any hint of corporate or military influence over the press is, of course, anathema. If anyone is in an obvious position to manufacture consent, citing Chomsky's own book, it is, as Walter Lippmann openly proposed, citation here, linking to Public Opinion, the book authored by Walter Lippmann. First, the journalists themselves. And next, the universities which they regard as authoritative. Yet strangely, the leftist has no interest whatsoever in this security hole. This can only be because it is already plugged with his worm. The complaint of the Chomskyan, in other words, always occurs when the other team is impudent enough to try to manufacture a bit of its own consent. Hence, the blue pill. But there is another card I've been holding on, because it's kind of difficult to explain. See, the problem is not just that our present system of government might be described succinctly as an atheistic theocracy, is accidentally similar to Puritan Massachusetts. As anatomists put it, these structures are not just analogous, they are homologous. That is to say, citation here, homology in biology is the same way that a human, a dog, and a bird all have the same bones in their arms. What happens is that in developmental biology, organs that developed in the embryo in the same manner as from similar organs, such as those matching primordial creatures in successive segments of the same animal, are serially homologous. That is to say, they are homologous. The architecture of government, theocracy secured through democratic means, is a single continuous thread in American history. An excellent historical description of this continuity is George McKenna's Puritan Origins of American Patriotism. It gets a little confused in the 20th century, but this is to be expected. However, as a demonstration, I am particularly partial to one particular primary source, American Malvern, from 1942, linked here by the way, which I found somehow in Time Magazine's online archive. Alright. Religion, American Malvern, Monday, March 16th, 1942. These are the high spots of organized U.S. Protestantism's super Protestant new program for a just and durable peace after World War II. Point. Ultimately, a world government of delegated powers. Point. Complete abandonment of U.S. isolationism. Point. Strong, intermediate, and immediate limitations on national sovereignty. Point. Strong, immediate limitations on national sovereignty. Point. Strong international control of all armies and navies. Point. A universal system of money, so planned as to prevent inflation and deflation. Point. Worldwide freedom from immigration. Point. Progressive elimination of all tariff and quota restrictions on world trade. Point. Autonomy for all subject and colonial peoples, with much better treatment for Negroes in the United States. Point. No punitive reparations, no humiliating decrees of war guilt, no arbitrary dismemberment of nations. Point. A democratically controlled international bank to make development capital in all parts of the world without the predatory and imperialistic aftermath so characteristics of large-scale private and governmental loans seem to have. This program was adopted last week by 375 appointed representatives of a 30-odd denominations called together at Ohio Wesleyan University by the Federal Council of Churches. Every local Protestant church in the country will now be urged to get behind the program as Christian citizens, unquote. Its sponsors affirmed, quote, we must seek to translate our beliefs into practical realities and to create a public opinion, which will ensure that the United States shall play its full and essential part in the creation of a moral way of international living, unquote. Among the 375 delegates who drafted the program were 15 bishops and 5 denominations, 7 seminary heads, including Yale, Chicago, Princeton, Colgate, Rochester, 8 collegiate and university presidents, including Princeton's Harold W. Dodds, practically all the ranking officials of the Federal Council, and a group of well-known laymen, including John R. Mott, Irving Fisher, and Harvey S. Firestone, Jr. Intellectually, said Methodist Bishop Ivan Lee Holt of Texas, quote, this is the most distinguished American church gathering I have seen in 30 years of conference going. The meeting showed its temper early by passing a set of 13, quote, requisite principles for peace, unquote, submitted by Chairman John Foster Dulles and his Interchurch Commission to study the basis of a just and durable peace. These principles, far from putting all of the onus on Germany or Japan, bade the US give thought to the short-sighted selfishness of its own policies after World War I, declared that the US would have to turn over a new leaf in the world, that way to enjoy lasting peace. Excerpts. For at least a generation, we have held preponderant economic power in the world, and with it the capacity to influence decisively the shaping of world events. It should be a matter of shame and humiliation to us that actually the influences shaping the world have been largely irresponsible forces. Our own positive influence has been impaired because of concentration on self and on our short-range material gains. If the future is to be other than a repetition of the past, the U.S. must accept the responsibility for constructive action commensurate with its power and opportunity. Accordingly, the possession of such natural resources is a trust to be discharged in the general interest. This calls for more than an offer to sell to all on equal arms. Such an offer may be a futile gesture, unless those in need can, through the selling of their own goods and services, acquire the means of buying. With these principles accepted, the conference split up into 4 groups to study, respectively, the social, economic, and political problems of the post-war world, and the problem of the Church's own position in that world. Discussion waxed hot and heavy, with one notable silence. In a week when the Japs were taking Java, discussion of the war itself was practically taboo. Reason. The Federal Council felt that, since 5 of its other commissions are directly connected with the war effort, the conference's concern should be with the plans for peace, not that. One war statement, "The Christian Church, as such, is not at war," was proposed by editor Charles Clayton Morrison of the influential and isolationist before Pearl Harbor, Christian Century. This statement was actually inserted in a subcommittee report by a 64 to 58 vote after a sharp debate. In the plenary session, however, it was ruled out of order. Some of the conference's economic opinions were almost as sensational as the extreme internationalism of this political program. It held that a new order of an economic life is both imminent and imperative. A new order that is sure to come through either a voluntary cooperation within the framework of democracy or through explosive political revolution. Without condemning the profit motive as such, it denounced various defects in the profit system for breeding war. Demagogues and dictators, mass unemployment, widespread dispossession of homes and farms, destitution, lack of opportunity for youth and security, and for old age. Instead, the Church must demand economic arrangements measured by human welfare, must appeal to the Christian motive of human service as paramount to personal gain with governmental coercion. Collectivism is coming, whether we like it or not. The delegates were told by no less a churchman than England's Dr. William Paton, co-secretary of the World Council of Churches. But the conference did not veer as far to the left as its perceived, definitively pinko British counterpart. The now famous Malvern Conference, time January 20th, 1941. It did, however, bring up Labour's demand for an increased share in industrial management. It echoed Labour's shibboleth that the denial of collective bargaining, quote, reduced labor to a commodity, unquote. It urged taxation designed, quote, to the end that our wealth may be more equitably distributed, unquote. It urged experimentation with government and cooperative ownership. Every individual, the conference declared, has the right to full-time educational opportunities, to economic security and retirement, to adequate health service, and an obligation to work in some socially necessary service. The conference statement on the political basis of a just and durable peace proclaimed that the first post-war duty of the Church, quote, will be the achievement of a just peace settlement with due regard to the welfare of all the nations. The vanquished, the overrun, and the victors alike. In contrast to the blockade of Germany after World War I, it is called for immediate provision of food and other essentials after the war for every country needing them. Quote, we must get back, quote, explained Methodist Bishop Francis J. McConnell, quote, to a stable material prosperity, not only to strengthen men's bodies, but to strengthen their souls. Politically, the conference's most important assertion was that many duties now performed by local and national governments can now be effectively carried out only by international authority. Individual nations, it declared, must give up their armed forces, quote, except for preservation of domestic order, unquote, and allow this world to be policed by an international army and navy. This League of Nations with teeth would also have, quote, the power of final judgment in controversies between nations, the regulation of international trade, and population movements among nations, unquote. The ultimate goal, quote, a duly constituted world government of delegated powers, an international legislative body, an international court with adequate jurisdiction, international administrative bodies with necessary powers, and adequate international police forces and provision for enforcing its worldwide economic authority, unquote. Despite their zeal for world political, social, and economic unity, the churchmen were less drastic when it came to themselves. They were frank enough to admit that their own lack of unity was no shining example to the secular world, but did no more than call for, quote, a new era of interdenominational cooperation in which the claims of cooperative support and effort should be placed, so far as possible, before denominational prestige, unquote. The nice thing about reading a primary source from 1942 is that you are assured of its period credentials. Unless, of course, someone has hacked Time's archive, the author cannot possibly know anything about 1943. If you find a text from 1942 that describes the H-bomb, you know the H-bomb was known in 1942. One such text is entirely sufficient. What's great about the American Malvern article is that while it describes a political program you will place instantly, it describes it in a very strange way. You are used to thinking of this perspective, which is obviously somewhere toward the left end of your NPR dial, as representative of a political movement. Instead, the anonymous Time reporter describes it as a religious, quote, super Protestantism, quote, to be exact, program. Isn't that just bizarre? We have caught the worm in the act of turning. The political program and perspective that we think of as progressive is, at least descended from, the program of a religious sect. Unsurprisingly, this sect, best known as ecumenical mainline Protestantism, is historically the most powerful form of American Christianity, and happens to be the direct linear descendant of Professor Staloff's Puritans. You can also see it in abolitionism, the social gospel, the prohibitionists, and straight on down to global warming. The mindset never changes. For a brief snapshot of where we are today, or where it is today, try, quote, the Unitarian Church and Obama's religious upbringing, unquote. Note that Congregationalist and Puritan are basically synonymous, and American Unitarianism is a spin-off of Congregationalism. Of course, these belief systems have evolved since the time when these labels meant anything. Since the 1960s, they have merged into one warm, mushy, NPR-flavored whole, which we here at UR sometimes refer to as universalism. Michael Lerner, cited here, is perhaps the ultimate universalist. Thus, we see the whole awful picture merged together. It is Cthulhu. We don't live in something vaguely like a political Puritan theocracy. We do, kinda, live in an actual, genuine, functioning, if hardly healthy, 21st century Puritan theocracy. What this means is that you can trust hardly any of your beliefs. You are educated in this system, which purports to be a truth machine but is clearly nothing of the sort. Since the US is not the Soviet Union, hard scientific facts, physics, chemistry, biology, are unlikely to be wrong, but the Soviet Union actually did pretty well with that hard science stuff anyway. Other than that, you have no rational reason to trust anything coming out of the cathedral. That is, the universities and press. You have no more reason to trust these institutions than you have to trust, say, the Vatican. In fact, they are motivated to mislead you, in ways the Vatican's kinda not. Because the Vatican does not have deep, murky, and self-serving connections in the Washington bureaucracy. They claim to be truth machines. Okay, why wouldn't they? The cathedral, with its informal union of church and state, is positioned perfectly. It has all the advantages of being a formal arm of government, and none of the disadvantages. Because it formulates public policy, it is best considered our ultimate governing organ. But it certainly bears no responsibility for the success or failure of said policies. Moreover, it gets to program the little worm that is inserted into everyone's head, beginning at the age of 5 and going all the way through to grad school. Worst of all, the system is not a new one. It dates at least to FDR. Nor was the pre-FDR system of government in the United States particularly savory, nor was the one before that, etc. If you want to be completely disillusioned with mythic Americana, I recommend Peter Oliver, cited here, Peter Oliver's Origin and Progress of the American Rebellion, a Tory view, It is certainly interesting to know that ultimately the reason the Star-Spangled Banner waves o'er the home of the free and the land of the brave is that James Otis's father was not given a job. Citation here, citation 7. As Wikipedia notes, Otis graduated from Harvard 1743 and rose meteorically to the top of the Boston legal profession. In 1760, he received a prestigious appointment as Advocate General of the Admiralty Court. He promptly resigned, however, when Governor Francis Bernard failed to appoint his father to the promised position of Chief Justice of the province's highest court. The position instead went to longtime Otis appointment Thomas Hutchinson. In a dramatic turnabout following his resignation, Otis instead represented pro bono the colonial merchants who were challenging the legality of the writs of assistance before the Superior Court, the predecessor of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. So, it is no use deciding that the solution is to simply become a conservative. It's wonderful that you've gotten past progressivism, but you still need the red pill. The problem is much, much older and deeper than you think. I once teased the infamous Larry Alster, proprietor of View from the Right, the web's most thoughtful hardline conservative, that his blog should be called VFR 1960, because he sides with the right in every conflict named after 1960. Before 1960, however, VFR could more accurately be renamed View from the Left. Larry, bless his soul, didn't like that at all, but it still happens to be true. This is slightly daunting, but only slightly. We've not even gotten to the active ingredient in our red pill yet, certainly not the awful sodium core. We have presented an alternate picture of reality, in which you live not in a free, post-Orwellian world, but in an Orwellian mind control state, which is nasty, nasty hangover from the old weird past. To verify this conviction, however, we need to catch said mind control state in the act of actually controlling our minds. Therefore, since we cannot trust our existing beliefs, we need to look at the areas in which our universalist, quote, educations, unquote, may have caused us to misperceive reality. We must reassess our beliefs and compare the reassessment to the orthodox or perceived truth. If we see discrepancies, we confirm the Orwellian interpretation. If we see no discrepancies, well, then maybe the cathedral is just a truth machine, after all.